I thought sometimes we pray before, but let's, in the Abbey, we say what's called I'm not in the Abbey, but I kind of hang around here a lot. A doxology, which you probably all know after I start. It's very simple, but it's a way of placing us in the presence of God and the church. So if you would join as you are able. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen. Thank you. You can tell, right? Some of the, when you pray like that, right? Ever shall be versus will be forever. You're kind of listening for that. So that's the way we say it here, and the way I start my classes. So it's really, I think, important. Okay, so we're gonna not talk about the Gospel of Mark. I think. I don't know. We might get there. But my current project in the world of theology is a book on the early Christian Eucharist, which is why that's this presentation. So I'm currently working through that book, writing almost every day, and this is a way that I can bring some of those ideas to you, and to see if I'm on track, whether that actually can and does make any sense. So you are my guinea pigs. Am I okay on the, like this thing? Like, am I live or something now, or? I'm good, but I can't see how good I am. Okay, all right, so, and then this runs my slides. Okay, so let me give you what we're gonna do. And I'm gonna try to maybe do this as conversationally as I can. I always invite people to break in, raise your hands during the presentation, as well as we have a Q&A session. And some of you might be bored to tears, depending on what kind of classes or education or familiarity you have with the topic. I'm going to talk about what I call the context, the worldviews, out of which the early Christian Eucharist, which we celebrate now in the Mass, but in the ancient church was called the Supper of the Lord. And the first thing to think about in the context of the most ancient Christians, is that the Supper of the Lord was actually a supper, which is not what we do today. Really, I don't think anybody would actually think of what we do in the modern Roman Catholic setting as a supper. But that's how it started. So I want to talk about how we got here, how we got to the present conversation that we have, the present understanding. And of course, I'm an historical theologian, I'm a biblical person, scholar, and I always go back to where I can get at the earliest ideas, the earliest context, in order to then begin to trace it up through the centuries. And that's not what we're going to be doing today. We can't do the whole thing. But I want to start with the idea that most people start with their understanding of the Eucharist with the idea of transubstantiation. Right? So that's probably what people learn in catechism class, kind of what we teach our young people in some way, shape, or form. And that idea, that fancy word, transubstantiation, actually emerges 1,300 years after the earliest Christians. So the intriguing thing is, well, then how did they understand what the Eucharist was prior for the first 1,300 years? Before we get to that understanding, which is what I'm interested in. And further, I'm interested in going all the way back to the very, very earliest understanding, and hanging around there with some of the texts that we have, some of the writings that we have Am I doing something wrong? Should I take this vest off? Is that doing? We're good? Technological issues. Never happens. Okay, so it's going to be kind of a whirlwind. And I want to make sure that you know that what I am talking about that seems, how could that ever relate to what we're actually talking about in terms of the Eucharist? Why is it necessary, right? So you're going to have just a bit of faith in what I give to you today. And I hope then, after I give you some of the context, we can begin to make some of the connections about the subject of what the early Christian Eucharist is. The thing that strikes me about this subject is how touchy it is. And I mean, people have a lot of emotional, spiritual, religious investment in the Eucharist and in the sacraments generally. I was reminded of how touchy the subject was during COVID. So as Grace mentioned, I'm a deacon at Pax Christi in Eden Prairie. And of course, like all the parishes, we were like, what do we do with COVID? How do we do the Eucharist? And our church wanted to keep distributing the Eucharist, but to do it safely. So what we came up with was to have the Eucharist available at the back of the church individually as people left the church after Mass. And I have never seen such vitriol by Christians who are supposed to love each other. It was a nightmare of, we have committed the worst possible sin, the heresy of heresies. And all our thinking was we wanted to give people access to the Eucharist and do it safely. And if you recall, there weren't many guidelines for this. Everybody was in a quandary. What should we do? But what that told me in terms of my work was I'm working with something that people have such an investment in, such a relationship to, an identification with, that I have to tread lightly and be careful in how I do this. And I want to tell you right off, I am trying to be careful with how I do this. I obviously have a relationship with the Eucharist like you do. I am totally committed as a Catholic Christian to what the Eucharist is. But I'm also totally committed to understanding what it is that I'm involved with. And as a scholar, that takes me back to try to uncover how this came to be. How our understanding that we mostly carry around with us, where does it come from? And so that's my subject. And sometimes in doing that, you know, you're peeling back the covers and it makes people nervous. There's a sense of which now I'm somehow not being reverential enough to the subject. And I can't prevent that. I have to look at this like a scholar looks at this, and then take that and say, okay, but now we also have these other aspects to what it is in our spiritual life and our devotional life. Okay, so that's my caveat. I don't mean to upset anybody. I probably will. It's okay. So I'm going to get started now. If I just click this, does it work? Is that how it? That's not it. That's not. Here I am. Okay. Now, I want to start with what some of you, I'm looking around, some of you are as old as I am, remember from the past, right? what the sort of the way that the Eucharist was celebrated prior to the Second Vatican Council and is still celebrated in some very conservative Catholic churches. And even lately, a small revival of this understanding or this practice of the Eucharist. So just look at the picture here. First of all, language in Latin. Language in Latin, right? Think about what the function is of language in Latin that 98.3% of us don't understand. So just hold that thought, right? Don't understand the language. Incense, obvious, right? The kind of aura of holiness all over. Lighted candles breaking through the darkness. So mystery, light, flickering. Elevation of the priest to the east. I was telling this to my undergraduate students the other day. You know, drive around and look for an older Catholic church and then realize that you can tell what direction you're actually driving without a GPS because that church will be facing east. The altar will be in the east. So high altar facing east, alone and separate from the people of God. That's important, right? There is in this understanding, usually there is also an altar rail that surrounds the altar before you even get there to approach. So alone and separate from the people of God, the elevation of a small, perfectly circular piece of bread. A small circular piece of bread that no one, and I said I'm not trying to be impious here, that no one would recognize as actually bread. Right? When you have Thanksgiving, this is not it. Golden paten and golden chalice. So again, absolute, the beauty, the transcendence. What I'm trying to communicate to you is the otherworldliness of this, which is powerful, and why it is, in fact, so attractive to so many Catholic Christians. Audience participation time. When are the bells sounded during Mass? At the elevation, right? So there's a moment that you're drawn to, the elevation of the host and the chalice and the bells. So you're drawn to that. So what is signaled by that? This is easy. This easy question. Why the bells right then? Transubstantiation, which is what? Right, the change. The moment of change. Now, right, the moment of change to what becomes an interesting question, right? And you would say automatically the body of Christ, and then it would be, well, what does that actually mean? Right? So what is the something into which this is changed? How do we understand what that is? And you've got to be curious at that point, because that can't be obvious. Even if you've been well trained in Baltimore catechism, it's not obvious. So then the other aspect to the high altar facing east with the elevation at the moment of consecration, the sacrifice. So what do we understand about the sacrifice of Christ that is present at that Eucharist, at that moment? So we're going to hold that in. These are things to think about as we go through this presentation. The priest turned around and faced away from the high altar. What does it mean that the priest is facing away and up from the people of God? Away and elevated and up, right? So even spatially, toward the transcendent. So everything we've talked about so far is up, up, and away, and mysterious. Right? So that's the understanding of what's happening, of central significance. Golden, bejeweled, inscribed chalice, just enough for the priest alone to drink. Right? So this is, now just think about this for a second, basic. This is not obviously at this point a shared meal. There's only enough wine for the priest to drink, and if there's a deacon, he gets some maybe, but there's only that much. We are not, as a rule, in this context of pre-Vatican II or a very conservative understanding of the liturgy, we are not, as a rule, going to have the cup available to the laity. It will be reserved to the priest, maybe the deacon. So we are further, right? And I'm going to keep coming back. We are further from the idea of an actual shared meal, right? How many, well, maybe you guys do, but if you bring out gold plates and gold cups for your meals, right? And the bowl filled with unnaturally shaped circular bread. And this is where I get into trouble, right? Because people's investment in what that is, I'm just trying to understand why it would be small, white, circular, and not real bread by any definition. And then think about its ethereal quality. Right? So you could have the host, and it literally gives you the sense of it could go up or down. It's literally completely thin to almost disappearing. So that sense of it, and right, if you are in this context, if you are attending a liturgy of this variety, you would certainly not accept that in your hand. Right? You wouldn't do this. You'd put your tongue out. And, are you ready for this? This is the way I was taught. This is what I was taught. Don't chew it. So how many meals do you eat that you don't chew? So now you're into this, right? Everything fits here in terms of the understanding of what this is. And there is nothing in this understanding that you would equate with or describe as a meal. So that's where we are. Now this is the central point of my entire presentation. Somehow we got from a group of Jews who are followers of Jesus Christ having a meal together with bread and wine, and just hold on for a second. In the context of the ancient world, having a meal with bread and wine is the meal. And you're saying, well, that's not much of a meal. It is when you don't have vegetables and you don't have meat, and you've got two aspects of what you're eating. They're both well preserved in a hot, dry climate. You can have hardtack bread that can survive for days, and high content alcohol that can survive and not spoil. So now you can have a meal. So bread and wine, in the context of the ancient world, no one would say, well, you're not having a meal. You are. So, yes. We have great evidence that there were other things when they had them available. Yeah. So there's a famous text from the beginning of the 3rd century, so 180, 190, 200, right in that range, that describes what I call the full meal deal. It was the vegetables and other things that would be eaten at the meal. It's actually described. So we know that's true. That was controversial, wasn't it? No, it wasn't. You couldn't do it. Now you're helping me, because I I was only 8 years old.
Go one time because I went to the fountain. I had
And-
been to school, and I had a drink at the fountain, and then I started to cry. So I did go to you.
Wow, so not even water. And how about brushing of one's teeth? Was that okay? So everybody going to Mass had bad breath. Okay, so now that's interesting. That's really interesting because think about what I've been talking about so far, right? It is somehow from a meal to all of that, to not even being able to drink water prior to. Yes, well, that is yeah, no, yeah, I can repeat it. The question or the comment is about the manna from heaven, right? In the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy, the description of what's happening to the folks in the wilderness is that God provides for them, right? But think about that for a second. Yes, I mean, that's a sense of what it is, right? It's white, it's ethereal, it's manna from heaven. But that actually was given by God to nourish the Israelites. That wasn't, right? That was a meal, right? God provided the meal in the form of what is described as manna, but we don't actually know what that looked like, right? Bread of some sort, right? In terms of that description. So yes, manna from heaven, but also God's meal that you get to eat. And yeah, so this is, I just wanted to lay out the fact that it's kind of interesting that you could go from a meal to something that's not a meal, but is sort of the same thing because we say that it descends from that meal, right? So I just want you to get curious. That's all I'm very interested. I just want you to get curious as to how that happens, why, right? And that's what the subject of today's presentation is. How does that happen? But a few other trade-ins or two other aspects of this, right? We've talked about the cup not being distributed to the laity. And this is a recent book on the Eucharist, right? A Biblical Walk Through the Mass by Ascension Press. And notice, this is what I think is really interesting. Jesus is holding not a piece of bread, but a perfectly circular host that we might be familiar with. So that tells you how, in this particular case, this book is going to understand what this is. So I'm just trying to understand, right, where this understanding would come from. Oh, and I have another story here that's fascinating. It's not fascinating. Nothing I say is fascinating. But when I first came here to St. John's, so this was 30 years ago, and I would be teaching theology, I would have students who would come to me having gone to Mass in the Abbey Church. And if you've ever gone to Mass here, you realize that if you don't chew the bread that you're given, you are going to asphyxiate, right? You got to chew it. It's real bread. And I had students come to me and say, Professor of Theology, does that count? Right? Does that count for having received the Eucharist? And they were serious, and they thought that what was practiced in the Abbey with real bread could not possibly be the Eucharist. So now think about how far we've come in terms of, okay, so if the earliest Christians started with real bread, and now I have students who came to me when I first came here saying that because this real bread was being used, it doesn't count. It's not the real Eucharist. Which tells you something else, how fascinated we are by a particular form of the objective reality of what it is. Now, I know that gets really complicated mentally, but we're invested in the particular form of what it is. So if it's not the circular white piece of bread, we react because we've been deeply formed in what this is supposed to be, which is okay. We have a spiritual investment in that. We have a religious investment. I get that. But my job is to ask, where does that deep relationship with the particular form of what this is, where does that come from? And I'm going to stop a second. I tell my students this all the time, right? We think that we are somehow not, in some way, I don't know how this happened. We think somehow we are not actually the products of the culture in which we were raised. Somehow we're not affected by those values, those ideas, those sensibilities. And yet look around and you say, well, of course, that's how we come to know who we are within a particular culture. And all you have to do is to compare your understanding of something to someone who's from a different culture, and it looks like, oh my gosh, wow, we're having a conversation here. You understand things totally differently than I understand things. How did that happen? We're both human beings. And that means that the culture that I was formed in has formed my understanding, and the culture that the other person was formed in informs their understanding. And now we have a conversation based on different understanding, which is fine. That's what we do as humans. But I just want folks to recognize the power of cultural formation. This is why this is fascinating. I think everything's fascinating. Catholics who are raised Catholic, going to Mass, maybe even Catholic grade school, right? Going to Mass, and they fall away from the church. 25 years later, they've never been in a Catholic church, and they're presented with a form, like a license form, and they have to identify what religious tradition they are. They'll still say Catholic. It's absolutely amazing. Because they were formed in that particular culture, somehow deeply understand themselves as Catholic. And that's the power of culture, right? That's working within a particular religious form of cultural upbringing. So all of this is very powerful. That's just a picture of the silver and gold, right? I've always been fascinated by this, and this change just happened, right? We were told at some point, not too long ago, to move away from stoneware right now in the present church. I can tell you archaeologically, in the area of Palestine in which Jesus operated, there was not a bejeweled chalice anywhere in the vicinity. All they had was simple pottery. That's all we found archaeologically. So we've moved, right? The understanding, this is my whole point, has moved from the origins of things. The Greek is in particular interesting, that the famous line of the Last Supper in Mark 14:23, he took the cup. The Greek word is more literally translated the ordinary cup. That was the word for the simple pottery. There was another word for fancy. So even reading the text of the Gospels, you realize that we've come a long way from that understanding. Eucharistic adoration, right? The practice of ocular devotion. I'm getting somewhere. Trust me on this. Ocular devotion is just contact with the eyes and no physical, right? No physical touching. Think about the relationship of that to don't put it in your hand, put it on your tongue, right? Think about that sensibility, that otherworldly sensibility. No one could eat from that monstrance. Elevated hands wrapped in liturgical vestments not to be touched by human hands. And on the right, I've got Plato's Timaeus, but I'm going to come back to that. How Plato understood perfection in circular form. There it is, another picture. Does this look like a meal? And this is a currently advertised supply of Eucharistic hosts for Catholic churches. This is on the web right now. The finest altar breads in quality and packaging, over 70 years serving parishes, made of non-GMO, pure wheat flour and water without additives. All breads are packaged minutes after baking, and here's the part, right? And untouched by human hand. As if human hands, human touching, would corrupt what that is. Yeah. Why do we have to have particles of wheat for this to be a valid Eucharistic bread? And if I had the answer to that question, I would be Theologian of the Year. I do not have the answer to that question, especially since John's Gospel makes it specific that it was barley. So now you've got a contest. And we're not, the word for wheat doesn't appear in the Synoptic Gospels in that context. So we have zero understanding of why that would be the case. But again, think about this. What happens, what we're talking about is what happens in the growth of the tradition, in the understandings that change over time. So we should always be curious about how that happens. Start out with, in the Gospel of John, barley, and now wheat is required, right? Or to start out with a meal in which everybody's sharing the meal, to it's just obviously not a meal. And cannot be touched. No, it's got to have a little teeny bit of wheat, right? Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know, is this conversation being picked up by the people? So the conversation in the audience here is over the situation of a celiac person who is allergic to the wheat and barley, and what we do currently in terms of making sure there is some wheat in it, slight amount, right? So yeah, so that's sort of a current fascinating liturgical discussion, right? That's again, right? You would have to say that if you were trying to understand this, if I were a theologian trying to understand this, I would have to be able to make an argument that the original meal, which was real bread and sometimes barley bread and just bread, somehow now has to be specified as, something else. And I just think that's for me, it's a fascinating moment. Over here. There's a big controversy over that. Probably I'm gonna offer my own, and we're here at St. John's University, the home of liturgical scholarship. So everything I say is like, oh my God, I've got two colleagues out there saying you're just full of it. But my response is it's probably in the medieval, when I say medieval, from the period of 500 to 1500, probably earlier in that part of the churches. Not necessarily. So it depends on how they thought of the relationship of the bread to the Passover meal, which would have been unleavened. Some of the earliest Christians would have made that connection, and so the bread would have been unleavened. Others would not have made that connection as strongly. Right. Yeah. Yeah, and that would be the Gentiles who are coming in would not have that deep sensibility about the nature of the unleavened bread. But stop a second, and your reference, Beatrice, is a really good one. And you'll read book after book on this, the connection of the early Christian meal to the Passover meal, which is the way that it's written in the Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels, and in John. Right, so but now all I would say, thinking about this is, I don't know how many of you here have attended a Passover Seder, the meal, right? What's characteristic about the Passover Seder? Blessing and breaking and the passing of bread, absolutely. And the drinking of the cup, right? The remembering of the Passover, it takes about, if you're doing it right, about 2 hours, right? To eat this Passover meal. But the thing about the Passover meal is that it's a meal. Yeah, you've got all kinds of foods that are being blessed and shared, and right, it's beyond the full meal deal. It takes 2 hours to eat this thing, right? So even if the early Christians were mostly connecting their Lord's Supper with the Passover meal, it would have been still the meal part, right? It's still the point. Here's the thing about the Passover meal. A lot of prayers, one after the other, right? My first Passover Seder, I was like, my butt's getting sore. 2.5 hours of sitting here eating this meal, but I loved it. But the idea here is that, think about the context of the Passover meal. And I'll get back to some of this, but they're gathered in a group of Jewish people in the situation of the Exodus, where God is going to deliver them from chaos. The chaos, right? The chaos is all around them. God's about to deliver them through the waters of the Red Sea to the wilderness, away from the chaos of Egypt, away from violence and oppression. So it is literally a celebration of freedom in God. The absence of chaos, the absence of oppression, the absence of violence that they experience. So if you can imagine the world as it should be, and this is really important, the world as it should be, the world that God intended. God did not intend the violence, the oppression, the degradation, the inhumanness. God intended what this meal is, where everybody gets to share and everybody eats at this meal. That's the world that God intended. So the Passover meal is an enactment, and that's a really important word, an enactment, a physical enactment, an actually doing of the world that God intended, which, when connected to the early Christian practice of the meal, is exactly what the earliest Christians were doing in eating that meal, literally enacting the world that God intended. Now, you've got to think about where, and I'll get back to this, where that world was located. The world that God intended is not located in some ethereal, transcendent place up there. It's in the actual enactment of the physical meal, sharing with each other in this world the way that it should be, if it's following God's intention. And there is going to be the major difference in terms of what I'm talking about today. So I just spoiled the whole plan I had. But I just want you to, because this is hugely important in terms of the present conversations around the liturgy of the Eucharist. So back to this, untouched by human hand. Transcendent, everything I've shown you so far. Everything we've been talking about. Transcendent, otherworldly, mysterious, the world out there is how you would understand what's happening in the Eucharist. Right? Even to the point that I can remember this from my childhood. Right? I remember, and my father was extremely devoted Catholic. He would sit in Mass. I remember being a kid, I'm 7, 8 years old, I'm fidgeting. He would sit in Mass, and of course it was the altar, the priest was faced away, the whole thing. And he had his rosary. And all he did that entire Mass was to sit there doing his rosary. And that was his relationship to God at Mass. It didn't matter if anybody else was there. It didn't matter who was there. It didn't matter. And nothing mattered in those. It didn't matter if the singing, for God's sakes, no one sang. Why Catholics can't sing is pretty obvious. And it was an individual relationship of God in the place of absolute transcendence into the transcendent world of God. It was not, I'm going to get in trouble here. It was not about the community. It was about what was being done on that altar. It was not about who was on your left and who was on your right and who could be here and who couldn't be here and all that. It was about that. And now you have to ask yourself, if this what we're doing is connected to those Passover meals or to the other kinds of meals I'm going to talk about, how did that happen? So that it's not about the fact that there are people eating here with you and what their situation is and how we form the bonds of relationship and how we care about each other. We mostly find out how we care about each other when we're eating together. That's when we talk, right? That's the importance of the whole thing. So we're just in a really interesting situation here in terms of this transformation, in terms of the understanding. So, if you Google Catholic communion ritual online, which is the Google machine, this is one of the things you get right up top. Communion on the tongue helps to foster a proper sense of reverence and piety. To step up to a communion rail, remember the altar would be guarded, right, with a communion rail, and kneel and receive on the tongue is an act of utter and unabashed humility. In that posture to receive the body of Christ, you become less so that you then can become more. Now there's some really great aspects to that. Humility is a good thing. But the idea that you would not, right? Again, you're not eating. The tongue is the proper way to receive communion. And you would have to have a host that would melt pretty fast if you're just having it on the tongue so you don't chew it. And so that's the theology, interesting theology, but you can imagine a different description, I think, of the same thing, of what communion is, right? A relationship that's formed by the eating of a meal together. It's better if you eat it with your hand because you're touching it with human hands, and that's important, right? You can imagine a different definition. And imagine, here's something is just, this is interesting. And this is right, got to buy the book, right? In the Gospel of Mark, look at the way that Jesus interacts with other people in need, right? Just look at the stories, and I challenge you to count the number of times that Jesus heals and shows compassion by touching. Right? So the human interaction through touch. So not, right? And now you're saying the Eucharist, the best thing about the Eucharist is it would be untouched. by human hands. So this is the great turn in world history. The Greek king Alexander the Great conquers Palestine 3 centuries before Christ. So what I'm telling you is this. Everything I've talked about the transcendent, mysterious aspect of what the Eucharist is there also at the very beginning of the earliest Christian church. It's not like this was invented at some later date. The worldview, the idea of a real transcendent with which we have a relationship was the way that the ancient Greeks understood the nature of reality itself. Now, this means that, this is why I have that Alexander the Great thing. No one cares, right? Alexander the Great, what are you talking about? I remember when I was a kid, I had these little toy ancient soldiers, and I would reinvent the armies of Alexander the Great fighting the other people on the map of the world, right? It's how I learned how the world map worked. But the point of that exercise, and this interesting, is that, and you know this from grade school, Alexander the Great conquered the entire Eastern Mediterranean world, and he was a Greek. So the world changed 3 centuries before Jesus Christ. The world changed. Palestine changed. The Jews changed. Everything changed. The language changed. The culture changed. And there are, at the time of Jesus, in the earliest Christian churches, right? So here's the thing about what's absolutely, I think everything's fascinating. The Christian movement started with Jesus in Palestine with a bunch of Jewish people. And then it spread dynamically and quickly in a way that's inexplicable to people outside of Palestine who were not Jews. They were primarily Greek in orientation and culture. So when you think about Gentiles, the non-Jews, their primary culture is ancient Greek culture, and ancient Greek culture is what we're going to talk about. So the first persons, right, the first people that heard the message, Paul himself, right, the Apostle Paul, born in Tarsus, outside of Palestine, raised in the Greek language outside of Palestine, and spread the message of Jesus to other Greeks outside of Palestine. When did the Romans come in? Great question. They're always present. Oh, and I got to try to make this understandable. Rome conquered this entire area about 60 years before Jesus. Rome, the Latin Roman. So Roman Empire comes streaming down from the west toward the east. So I wish I had a map up here to show you. They are moving into the area of Palestine, Egypt, Syria, right? Roman conquest. Rome adopted and relished Greek culture, even Greek language. So there wasn't much of a cultural shift when Rome conquered this entire area. The Greek language, Greek cultural sensibilities remained intact. And it's not till centuries later that Latin would even emerge as a primary language in even the fringes of the areas that we're talking about. So that's a short answer. It's more complicated than that, but for the purposes of our understanding, all of the ancient Christians in the first 2 centuries were conversant with, spoke Greek, lived within Greek culture, except for the tiny bits of Jews that were still, there. But the spread of Christianity in the first 2 centuries was primarily a spread to Greek language and culture. And that's why, to understand the earliest Christian tradition, you've got to understand Greek language and culture. The New Testament was written in Greek. Paul spread his message to Greek cities. Even the Christians in Rome, right? Rome, the heart of Latin, spoke Greek for the first 3 centuries. How do we know this? We've got their inscriptions. They're all in Greek. So Greek was the dominant language in the early Christian church for the first 3 centuries. Caveat, a little bit of North Africa was beginning to be Latin, but that's a whole different story. I have another book on that. It's not out there. I just published one on this. Okay, so back to the story. I'm good? What do I got? Till 10, 15, 10, 30 something? Okay. You got to go, oh, God. Okay. I'm exhausted. What do we know about this? I want to put it to you in a nutshell. How would I make this kind of? Okay, I'm going to skip that. The most popular text in the ancient Greek world, the way that everybody would have understood creation itself, is in a book that Plato wrote called the Timaeus. He wrote this 3 centuries before Christ. The reason that this is important is that if you were an educated person in the ancient world, within that Greek culture, you would have known the Timaeus, even by the way that everybody knows about Adam and Eve, and they've never read Genesis. So the Timaeus tells us how this ancient Greek culture understood the nature of reality. And I know that sounds complicated, the nature of reality. But every culture has an understanding of the nature of reality. What you think is common sense is usually a cultural understanding. So the Greeks had this. And I'm going to give you some of the Timaeus in I hope, a translation that can make sense of it for you. It's kind of complicated Greek. It's even complicated in translation. But let's look at some of this together. Human nature at the beginning, right? How this came to be, right? How anything happened, the origins of the universe. Human nature was of 2 kinds. So the superior race would hereafter be called man. Now when and he's talking about souls here, so we got to think about what that means. When souls should be implanted in bodies by necessity and always gaining or losing some part of their bodily substance. So souls, now that we think about it as kind of the spiritual part of what it is to be a human, always gaining or losing some part of their bodily substance. Then in the first place, it would be necessary that they should all have in them one and the same faculty of sensation, that is, desires, arising out of irresistible impressions. So here's the main point. Desires, appetites, things that tie you to the body, hinder the soul with the spiritual part. Now, that's going to get more important as we go on here. In the second place, the souls must have love, in which pleasure and pain mingle, also fear and anger and feelings which are akin or opposite to them. And here's the important part. If they conquered these bodily emotions, right, the souls, that's what human beings are, they're souls, would live righteously. And if they were conquered by these emotions, they would be unrighteous. So the point of what you should be doing is to conquer your emotions your ties, your appetites, your emotions, your ties to the body in order to free yourself spiritually. Because the real deal, the real thing, is the spiritual world. And your soul, your spirit, is connected to that world, which is, you ready for this? Antithetical to the world of body. So if you ever have a sense of this, okay, I'll give you a story to kind of illustrate this. When I was growing up, a little town in South Dakota, and I'm a rough and tumble little guy, loved to play football without pads. My brother and I would, go out there and literally destroy each other. And I would take a tumble and my knee would be bleeding. And my father, who is he was in fact a German. Right? You got to get a sense of this. Would look at it and say, blood makes the grass grow. Get over it. And, and then I'd run to mom, because mom, she was good at this. She'd, you're so poor thing, right? But my dad was like, conquer your emotions. Conquer your sensibilities. Don't be tied to what that is, right? So that tells you how powerful this is. That understanding, this understanding of reality got into a philosophy called ancient Greek Stoicism, right? Which became a hallmark, and the kind of hardness of the human person, impervious human person, comes out of that understanding, even into our culture, into modern culture. So that part of the Timaeus, right? And here's the important part of that. Simple. It's called dualism. Your soul, your spirit, is separate from your body. And your body is potentially the enemy of your soul, your spirit. Yes, because that's how it all happened at the beginning. The souls come down and are implanted into bodies. So in Plato, they're pre-existent. They live up there with the stars at birth. Yeah, so it comes down at birth. The transcendent reality of the soul then takes its place within the body, and now you've got a task. So now the point of the soul is to get back to where it came from. I don't know what we believe now. I think people believe different things, right? Where did the women fit into this philosophy? I'm sorry, Beatrice, women don't fit into this philosophy. No. I'm going to get to that. I'm glad you asked that question. Where do women fit? But before I get there, let's talk about the circle as perfection. So this is from the Timaeus again. Now think about the white circular host. That's why we're doing this. First there was the moon in the orbit nearest the earth, and next the sun. And the second orbit above the earth, then came the morning star, and the star sacred to Hermes, we call Mercury, moving in orbits which have an equal swiftness with the sun. Now you have a picture of concentric circular spheres of the heavens. So they'd look up and say, look, the perfect pattern of the heavens is circle. Orbits and circular orbs. So now you've got a picture of rationality itself, of perfection. Circle. Perfect circle. And you start to get it, right? Now you stop and think, okay, so what was the question? When does the host become a circular piece of bread? And I'm saying the medieval period. And why do I argue that? Because that's precisely when this understanding of reality in the ancient Greek tradition becomes really, really important in the early Christian church. So my guess is it's about then, right, in terms of how that happened. To the end that the created heavens might imitate the eternal nature and be as like as possible to the perfect and intelligible world, the world of God, the world of God mind. So in blue here, the created, that's me, right, on my commentary. The created heaven imitates the intelligible world of the ideal forms, the world of God. To study astronomy is to study divine rationality, right? I say, consider the Pythagorean theorem. You all know this. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. That's the formula for the right triangle. But there has never, this is Plato's understanding, there has never been in any concrete, physical, right triangle perfection. It is flawed to some infinitesimal degree. Well, I messed up that word. Right? An infinitesimal flaw. Plato would say this: everything in the physical world is flawed. Every physical thing is flawed. And how do you know that? It is not perfect. It dies. It is potentially corrupt. It is potentially not perfect. And so the only perfection is what Plato would call the idea of the right triangle. The formula in your mind, every right triangle that you can percolate in your mind is perfect. It will always be perfect. It was there at the beginning of eternity. It will be there at the end of eternity. It is eternal and perfect. So if you want something to be thought of as eternal and perfect, you're moving away from the material world, away from the body, right? And now I want you to make some connections here. If you're thinking along these lines, imagine that everything you do with the Eucharist has to be away from the material world, away from the body, toward the transcendent. And now you start to get where that sensibility influencing the church starts to change how you understand what we're doing in the Eucharist. You can even get to the point of ocular devotion where you do not touch what this is. It's part of that transcendent world, the perfect world. Is this being discussed at the Synod? I hope there are theologians that can master this discussion. It's the only hope I have. But hopefully, yes. They didn't invite me to the Synod. I'm not going to get invited anywhere anytime soon. Here's your Beatrice. Here's Beatrice's question. Ancient misogyny, hatred of women. Human nature was of two kinds, so that the superior race would hereafter be called man, male. I should have put that in the translation. Now, when they, the souls, should be implanted in bodies by necessity, and always gaining or losing some part of their bodily substance, then in the first place it would be necessary that they should all have in them one and the same faculty, sensation, desires arising out of irresistible impressions. So the souls start out equal. But now what happens? In the second place, the souls must have love, in which pleasure and pain mingle, also fear and anger, and the feelings which are opposite to them. If they conquer these bodily sensations, they would live righteously, and if they were conquered by these emotions unrighteously, and here's the kicker. I'm sorry, I should just tell you the kicker. The soul implanted in the body starts its journey up to being the soul of eternity. And the better it is at gaining less body, the more spiritual it becomes, and spiritual equals male. So, you said it, I did not. So the statement was, is that why only males can be priests? It's a huge part of it, right? So the more perfect soul, right? So here's right? Females are identified with body. Males are identified with soul. They are more rational. And the soul's journey is toward the male. If the soul can become less female, right, tied to the body, and become more male, that would be achieving its proper point of salvation. And wow, I mean, but like, just get one tidbit, the ramifications of this. If women are tied to the body, and from a male perspective, right, women represent the elicitation of desire, sexual desire. I see a woman's body, my reaction is desire. What's happening? Oh my gosh, I'm becoming less spiritual. So the female represents a threat to my achieving true rationality, which is the world of God absent the body and absent, right, emotions, absent appetite. Singular, isolated. Remind you of something, right? In terms of the ideal. So insofar as a male in the world can achieve singular isolation and removal from the corruption of the world, the desires of the world, especially females, the more perfect they are. And that is coming into an understanding just about the same time as you get the perfect singular, the perfect round host, right? The perfect round sense of what communion is. So it is tied together. It's obviously tied together. And now you have to kind of think, well, and then how does the tradition change? How do we think through this? How do we deal with the fact that this is part of our past? All of that. But this is a summary, and way too involved summary, of Hellenistic Greek dualism at the time of Jesus Christ. First, mind and soul are equivalent. That's the rational nature of being a human. The understanding of God is that God is mind. God is not a creator of the material world. Right? God, this is how God operates. This is the conception of God. God thinks. What's God's activity? God is mind. God thinks. What does God think? The ideal formula's rationality of the universe itself. Somehow, sometimes, part of that rationality gets trapped into the material world, which is literally nothing, of no account, except that it can bother the spiritual world. And then, right, the task is to get back to the world of the ideal form, the world that God is thinking. So I am saved if I can get there to pure, unencumbered rationality. Now, I got to tell you, this discussion that we're having right now is the discussion of the first 2 centuries of the Christian church. And here is the discussion. How does the event of Jesus Christ save you? In a Greek option, he saves you by giving you rationality. He teaches you who you truly are And once you discover who you truly are, that you are a soul trapped in a body, you can now turn toward your proper orientation to the world of God. You are saved by knowledge, by rationality, versus the understanding of Jesus Christ that you are saved by being a part of the creation that was created by God in the way that God intended that creation to be. So I know this probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it matters what you think God is. If God is a creator of the material world and has an intention for the order of the material world, and that's what you should be a part of, then your concern is, how am I in the material world in the right way with people and with the world itself? Because if we can get there, if we can get to the world that God intended in God's creation, we have done God's will. And that's our purpose. But on the Greek side of things, if God is mind and God is concerned only with the world of mind, of rationality, then our task is to get to that world of rationality and somehow participate in that world. Now, I want to submit to you that that's the basic difference between the understanding of the Eucharist as a meal and the understanding of the Eucharist as transcendent, ethereal, otherworldly reality. Because it's an understanding of where salvation is located. If it's located in that other world, you're going to do everything my opening slides said. It's going to be divine, transcendent, in Latin, mysterious, facing away, singular, all of that. If it's not that, if it's how we are together in the world as God intended, in a created world of created bodies, then it's going to be about what we're doing here and who's eating it, who's eating this meal with us, and how are we together in the world. And that's the difference in terms of the clash of understandings in the ancient Christian churches. And it's never, ever going to be resolved because there were these Jewish ancient Christians who understood God as creator, and there were these Greek ancient Christians who understood God as mind. And we've had it ever since. It even gets more complicated, but you should realize that in our synoptic gospels, in our Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Jewish side wins. And I could go into that and explain that to you. John is teetering on the edge of the other side of this, right? It's a lot more about ethereal transcendent reality in the Gospel of John. But it's interesting, he brings it back in some ways, but that's a whole study of the Gospel of John. Okay, so now, right, so I've got all these things. Males are more rational, superior to females. The divine soul occupies an inferior material body. Souls come from the rational world of God and belong to the rational world of God. The world of God, the rational spiritual universe, is perfectly circular, astral deities in circular orbits. Then you have a line across, right? The body is below and inferior. It's physical and material. It's part of the imperfect world. And the rest of that really doesn't matter. But that is Hellenistic. That's Greek dualism at the time of Jesus that we're contending with. Eternal life is in heaven. If you ever thought about your soul, when you die, your soul goes to heaven and it's a spiritual place. The male soul who lived well during his appointed time was to return and dwell in his native star, and there he would have blessed in a congenial existence. But if he failed in attaining this at the second birth, he would pass into a female. So the understanding of Jesus as the superior rationality of the male soul. Now, I submit to you, if you start your understanding of the priesthood as in persona Christi, and then you go to this, you are going to have a male priesthood. And this is incredibly influential in the entire history of the Christian church. How one achieves salvation? To overcome by the help of reason, right in the middle of the turbulent and irrational mob of later material accretions, made up of fire and air and water and earth, all corporeal, and return to the form of its first and better state, the rational and the incorporeal soul. The single biggest conversation in the ancient Christian church, the single biggest question, was whether Jesus Christ was raised by God as a body or as a spirit. The single biggest controversy. The reason that the synoptic gospels were written to a large extent, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were to make the argument of the necessity of the corporeal resurrection of Jesus Christ, raised in the body and not as a spirit. Because, and just think about this for a second, the resurrection of Jesus Christ as a body in an ancient Greek understanding is completely incoherent, completely wrong-headed, because bodies are inferior. Bodies are corrupt. Bodies are the location of desire and appetites. They pull the soul down. The resurrection cannot be that. And this is now, this is right before, right? Think about what you think you're doing at the Lord's Supper or at the Eucharist. If you're at the Lord's Supper, you're at the Eucharist, what you're saying is, what you're claiming is, we are in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But if you say that the moment is that what's happened here in transubstantiation, or in the word, if you say, this is the body of Christ, and then we distribute communion and say, the body of Christ, and then you eat the body of Christ, ask yourself what that is. And if the body of Christ is a spirit, if perfection is spiritual, then by Lord, you shouldn't touch it. You shouldn't chew it. You should look to the transcendent reality. It's not about the created people next to you. In fact, desire can be problematic. All of that is the idea of what you think it is that is being enacted with the body of Christ. What is the content of the meal? Or, right, conversely, if it's a completely spiritual phenomenon, right, that's the difference. That's exactly the difference I'm trying to, like, where does this start? Where does it come from? Yeah, question. The question is Platonic philosophy here forever? Or do philosophers, obviously modern philosophers, trying to move away in various ways from that Platonic basis? But in the Christian theological tradition, it is so rooted and so powerful. And by Plato, and we shouldn't probably use the word Plato at some point. We should probably use the Greek philosophical tradition more largely understood, because other influences come in. But Christian philosophy or Christian theology is largely within that matrix. And to think your way out of it. A good Christian theologian spent a lot of time trying to do that. Because some Christian theologians would say we're more or less trapped by the weight of that within the tradition. Yes, they're Jewish. Right, Peter's married. All the apostles are married that we could. Yeah, oh, we would have to definitely, and that's why that part of it is not emphasized. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yes, right. It's a huge deal because of the weight of the tradition that would say that the priest should be male and isolate, and not involved in that intimately sexual way, celibacy. I'm not saying that that's how people would explain it now. I'm explaining where it came from. Now, as Michael was saying, we have to deal with what we've inherited. That's why I'm not that's not why I'm a modern theologian. I couldn't do it. I'm not smart enough. I can tell you where a lot of this stuff came from, and then as I give it to somebody else and say, now you deal with it. But I think, and this would be my, what do I want to leave you with in this part of the presentation, is that it maybe most of the earliest Christian churches, most of them probably, thought of the resurrection of Jesus Christ as a truly and only spiritual phenomenon. And they thought of their gathering as a spiritual, whatever their ritual of meal would have been, it would have been a spiritual experience. And there were other Christians, more on the Jewish orientation that we're going to talk about after we're break here, that were, their understanding of God was from the ancient Jewish understanding of God as the creator, and intimately involved with and participating in the material creation. And both these sets of Christians are writing texts that we have. They're practicing meals that we can trace in terms of how they understood. And at some point, right, that tension between those two understandings gets inside of the emerging Christian tradition right up to the present day. Right? And so now you're in a modern Roman Catholic parish and you hear the conversation between we should do more ocular devotion to be Catholic Christian. We should do more social justice to be Catholic Christian. And a lot of times those two groups don't like each other. And what I'm trying to tell you is this discussion, these understandings go back to the very, very, very beginning of the Christian movement. Everything as an interpretation of what was God doing in the event of Jesus Christ. Was he saving our souls, our spirits toward pure rationality? Or was he coming to bring God's intention for the creation and the people within the creation? And that still is the basis of our discussions, the basis of our argument, and the basis of our understanding of the Eucharist. So we're going to take a break now. I know you need it. And we're going to come back and I'm going to talk about my particular expertise is on the Jewish side of things. I tell people all the time, if I weren't a Roman Catholic, I would be a Jew. Because my understanding of God and my understanding of what God is directly out of that Jewish understanding. We're going to talk about it after break. Yeah, one more. Right, so the question of the male being in the dominant position of the household leads to a male, right? Yeah, right. Sociologically, that's all part of it, but underlying that domination of the male is that males are, quote, naturally superior. Yeah, so one more.
Godfrey said it takes more faith to believe that the host is spread than it does to Jesus.
There you go, a blast from the past. Godfrey Diekman was the person that when I came here, no one could replace Father Godfrey, but I took his job. And now this year I'm retiring, somebody's going to take mine. Well, what we're going to do now is maybe 10 minutes or so of a raising up of some of your questions. Grace is going to help me with a microphone so that everybody can hear what the question or participation is. I can't do this, but I'll try to keep my responses relatively, oh, sorry, I've got the cup in the way of the.
I think because there's a lot of questions online.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, I guess, nope, no questions.
You mean
It's open to the floor.
Okay, open the floor, over here. Oh, you gotta wait for Grace.
Sorry, but
This, we refer to Grace as amazing. Get that? Amazing Grace, okay.
Well, I kind of addressed this before the break, but I'm very curious how we got from the Jewish father or mother, whatever, being the presider to how we got where presiders are now. Male, cell, doesn't matter, but how it got so controlled.
Yeah, well,
And
that
institutional.
is a story in and of itself, but the prerequisite of understanding this is the position of the male in ancient society, in both the Jewish side and on the Greek side. So if very quickly, if you read the way that the ancient Jews understood the story of the creation of male and female in this, what we call the second creation narrative, Eve is taken out of the side of pre-existing male Adam. So that, if you just quickly think, is how she was understood as derivative from the male. On the Greek side, the female is always inferior because she is of the body and the male is of the spirit. So on both counts in the ancient Christian church, both in the Jewish side and on the Greek side, you had the superiority of the male. There was literally no chance of a different understanding. And I just invite you to realize that we don't understand it that way anymore. I mean, I don't know many people who would understand the inherent inferiority of the female. Maybe some people do, but I certainly don't. So we've got to deal now with a completely different understanding. But the church, of course, emerges from these ancient understandings, and that is our predicament. How do we deal with, if our understanding of these things has changed? How do we change our practices? So, yeah. Yeah.
How it got codified. I don't know if I'm using the right word.
Uh,
you have to be trained and you have to be ordained and blah, 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 blah.
A slow emergence over the natural proclivity toward the male, a slow emergence of acceptance of the idea that it could only be a male in these positions, and then that becomes institutionalized, and yeah. So another one? I can't decide. Go. Grace will decide.
All right. In regards to the early church, how did they view Mother Mary and Saint Joseph and Mary being kind of the co-redemptress?
Wow, that is a loaded question. How did the church understand Mary? You mean the female aspect of Mary in terms of that? I can tell you one thing that I think is quite surprising. There was a sense in which, in parts of the early church, that Mary had overcome her femaleness. And that was because if she was going to be the elevated, she would have been elevated toward the status of the male. So her soul being superior. So there was that, but there are lots of other, in the context of the ancient world, in terms of, and I'm just talking about the intelligentsia, the academic class. In popular culture, there would have been other understandings of the female, and it would have centered around reproductivity, and so yeah, there's a whole bunch there. Yeah, one more.
I'm just wondering about the monastic culture, right? The desert fathers and
Right,
mothers,
so, yes.
and where that, I mean, because that seems to be very, or could play into the dualistic side, the Greek culture of wanting to separate from the community versus.
Yes, yes, and of course the influence in early monastic culture, this would have been about 3 to 4 centuries after Jesus, there was a great deal of influence coming out of the Greek philosophical tradition. And so some of the ways that you see stories of what I would call hyper-asceticism, a kind of a battle with sexual thoughts, an attempt not to eat, these kinds of desert practices, they would have been influenced by that sense of I have to transcend my body in order to join the spiritual world, where they envisioned that's where Christ was. So there is that element to it. Definitely a battle, almost in a sense, some of these monastics would be a battle with the emotions. The interesting thing about the emergence of Benedict, and we're in a Benedictine place, in ancient monasticism, is it was a moderated form of that. It was a much I think other monastics would have said of Benedict's rule that it was wimpy. It wasn't stridently ascetic enough. So it's a fascinating. Of course, we have Father Columbus Stewart, who's the expert in all things early monastic, and just talk him into doing a theology day, and you get all that.
I read a book on the Mass and used a lot of big words, but there's one line I really remember, and I want to give it to you. It said, it's okay if the Mass looks like a meal. That brings up a very interesting question that I think no one here has the right answer, because we had a synod on the Amazon. It seems to me the synod on the Amazon said they will have to decide how they're going to celebrate this meal.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the meal aspect keeps coming up. And that's why, for example, I'll tell you a quick story. So when my father-in-law passed away, and my father-in-law, my wife's father, was an intensely devoted Catholic. And so, of course, we were going to have our funeral was going to be Catholic funeral. I was the deacon of the Mass, along with the priest of his home parish. And of course, the family, this is a large family. My wife's 8 brothers and sisters. They all have families. It's a big family, very loving, big family. And I've been so blessed to be a part of it. And they were at the funeral Mass. And at least probably 3/4 of that large family were no longer practicing Catholics, but they were all raised very Catholic. And before the Mass started, the priest, who was very conservative, said, we're not going to have the blood of Christ today. It's too much of a bother. And I think the way I'm thinking about this is as a meal of participation with a dearly beloved Father, and apparently we're not going to eat a meal, even symbolically. And I raised a fuss. I got into trouble, and I literally got him to change his mind because of who I was and what we were doing here. And then, right, we're at the front at the Eucharist with my father-in-law's casket there, and we're going to have communion. And that priest announces that if you're not a Catholic in good standing, you can't share this meal. And I'm standing next to him, and I'm in this moment of absolute horror. All my theology, everything in my being about being a Catholic Christian has now been challenged. And so as the communion starts, my family, my in-law family, sitting on one side, almost all together in the church, I did this. And that tells you my theology. And I just, what this meal is, who's there, how do we include people? How do we demonstrate that what the basis of the entire Christian understanding is that human beings are all children of God, every single person. And we manufacture exclusions. And we manufacture statuses and judgments. And if it's the one thing I know from my study of the Gospels, Jesus never did that. And I cannot figure out how we can base our understanding of being Christian on anything other than that we accept and love people. And let's talk about judgment later. So this is back to I'm going to flow nicely into my next part of my presentation, the Jewish understanding of this meal. I'm skipping ancient Jewish Christians. The worldview of ancient Jewish Christians. So we're doing the other worldview now, right? Jewish worldview. The Eucharist as the Lord's Supper has always been the manifestation of the resurrection of Christ. The Eucharist as the Lord's Supper has always been the manifestation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There was no moment of transubstantiation. The meal itself was the presence of the resurrected Christ, all the aspects of that gathering, of that meal. So if you can get your head around that, because Catholics have trouble, right, with this, that's how they thought of it. It was the meal itself was the manifestation of the resurrection. The manifestation of Jesus Christ has always been understood as a return to the community within creation as originally intended by God in Genesis. This is why Genesis is the most important book of the Bible, because it was the world of the first 7-day creation. So if you can just, we're going to talk about this, but the first 7-day creation by God is the perfect world. And then, of course, as you go on in the story, it kind of gets messed up, but the world is as it should be on the 7th day, which is why you get the number 7. You could do this. You could Google number 7 in the Bible and find, it's everywhere. So it's the manifestation of the perfection of creation. To understand the Eucharist as the manifestation of the resurrection, we have to consider how Genesis was understood at the time of the earliest Christians. What was God's original intention for a community within an ordered creation? In other words, what is God's intention for humanity within the creation that God has provided? So here's the obvious point. The location of salvation is in this world. The world as intended by God. It is not somewhere into the spiritual universe. And that's really hard for us to get our heads around. That what we do in this world is the salvation that God intended for this world, and God did not intend any other world than this one. Right? So you got to mix in a lot of other ideas but to realize that there is no Greek philosophical world of the ideal forms in Jewish thought, in Jewish understanding. And so their whole emphasis, right? Think about the Jewish tradition. And the first thing you do when you think about the Jewish tradition is, well, they're so tied up in all these things that they do or not do, right? You can't eat pork, and you have to keep kosher in other ways. One time I took my students I had a course called The Jewish Experience, and I took my students and they stayed with Jewish families, Orthodox Jewish families, as part of my course. And so I took them and I dropped them off with a Jewish family, and they spent the weekend with a Jewish family. And I picked them all up again after 3 days, and we came back to the classroom the next day, and I had them write a reflection on what was your experience living with an Orthodox Jewish family for 3 days. And 10 out of 12 students wrote the one thing that was the strangest thing, the thing I just was like blown away by, was you walked into this Orthodox Jewish home and there were 2 kitchens. And they just was like, why would there ever be 2 kitchens? And I said, meat has to be separate from milk. So when you're preparing the meat, it can't be anywhere near the milk or the dairy. So you need, if you're really going to work at this, you need 2 refrigerators, 2 sinks, right? 2 areas of preparation, because you got to keep the meat separate from the milk. And now you are all thinking, how silly is that? I know you're thinking that, because I used to think this all the time. Like, it's silly that you can't eat a cheeseburger, right? That doesn't make any sense. And now you should realize that you were raised in a culture penetrated by Greek rational philosophical thought, right? No, exactly. But the idea that you have to keep meat separate from milk, you ready for this? Is that there is an order to the creation that must be enacted, what God intended. Now we would think, how do you know that that's what God intended? That's what their tradition tells them. That there is an order to the creation that they have to abide by, and if they do so, creation will be as it was intended by God. And the world, you ready for this? The world will be saved as we do Torah, right? And that God's intention for the world will be manifest in the world. Now, this is important because it's not just that. In the Jewish tradition, all you have to do to get this is to read the prophets, right? The rich cannot take advantage of or oppress the poor, right? Orphans who cannot care for themselves must be cared for by the community. Widows who cannot fend for themselves must be cared for by the community. You cannot take advantage of your neighbor. Even the economic system can't be for raw, pure advantage. The economic system is envisioned by God is the celebration of what was called the Jubilee year. We don't know how they actually did this or if they actually did this, but there it is in Scripture. The Jubilee year, 7 times 7, in the 50th year, in the year of Jubilee, all property that has been gained at the advantage of your neighbor must be returned to its original owner. I always tell people it's like the game of Monopoly, right? You play it, somebody wins, you start the game over. Because the point of the point of economic activity is not to take advantage of your neighbor. And that has to be rectified at some point, and we start over. You cannot think that that's what you're doing. You cannot think that you're engaged in economic activity so that you can have one up over somebody else. Right? The basis of all Catholic social teaching, by the way. It's not my area, but that's where it comes from. So the prophets tell you, if you read them, the way that the community should be within the ordered creation. So what you're doing in enacting the ordered creation by keeping the meat from the milk is to abide by what God intended, and God intended all these other moral aspects to how to be a Jew in the world. And it's all of a piece, because as we know, you do something, you think about what you're doing, who am I in doing this? Isn't this fascinating? If every time you eat with intention, I'm not eating meat with milk today because I'm a Jew, what else is there about being a Jew that I'm attending to? Oh, I'm attending to how Jews should treat other people. I'm attending to not exploiting the poor and the oppressed. On and on and on, right? The identity of a person in what they do that is then part of who they are, and who they are is a certain way of being a person in the world or a community in the world. And it's really hard for us to get that, but it's absolutely the case, and it's the power, it has always been the power of the Jewish tradition. Yes? Yep, we get a smattering, right? Yeah, so the Catholic practices during Lent are for intentionality. Who am I as a Catholic Christian, right? What are all the aspects of what it should be to be a Catholic Christian when I'm paying attention to what I eat? Which is, you know, it's a, right? The denial of, think about the difference here. This is interesting. I am going to deny, just think about Lenten practices. I am going to deny myself in order to deny my body so that I can escape from my body to the spiritual world. Versus, I am going to think about what I eat so that I recall that I am a Catholic Christian. What is the identity of a Catholic Christian? Oh, I should be more charitable. And that's a whole different way of thinking about what you're doing and paying attention to the body. Now, there are very strong traditions on both sides of this, but one's coming from the Jewish understanding of how and why you would fast or deny yourself or practice these things, and the ancient Greek tradition of why you would fast or deny yourself in terms of what you're doing. Well, no, because Jewish Christians, that's obviously the difference, right? So they kind of died out. I mean, this is the irony of it. I have been given such a privilege of study for all these years, and I'm still fascinated by what I study. And one of the things that's most fascinating is that the original Jewish Christian communities that followed Jesus in Palestine and Syria, these would have been the earliest churches, kept going. And they were Jewish. I mean, literally Jewish Christians. And they kept going for 100 years until it came to the point where other Christians who had become more Greek in terms of their understanding looked at the original Jesus churches and said they were heretics because they were, quote, too Jewish. And that is also the beginning of anti-Semitism in the Christian church, which you should know has been part of the Christian church almost from the very beginning. And obviously the ramifications of that, the history of that is just a sad part of Christian experience. So yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon that happens. And part of that is the change in worldview that happens. Okay, so now let's get on with what God does in creation. This is a nod toward a book by John Levinson, who's an Orthodox Jew who wrote a book called Creation and the Persistence of Evil, but I put in the title Chaos. And he said God acts as an Israelite priest to fashion the creation out of chaos. So I originally had a demonstration over here. I don't know, it's out from the camera here, and I'm not going to do it because I'm going to make you imagine it. This is how the ancient Jews understood what God does in creation. Originally, there's water. So water is everywhere, and God's intention, manifest in God's Spirit, so Genesis 1:2 says the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters, enters into the waters, and that becomes creation. So the Spirit of God pushes back the waters, literally forms the creation out of the waters. And that takes 7 days of forming out of what's originally there, the chaos that's originally there. And so in the ancient Jewish understanding, the ordered creation is challenged by chaos and sustained by God's Spirit. And the contest between the Spirit of God in the creation and chaos is the contest of a desire on the part of chaos to return to its original position. And the reason that I do this demonstration is because what I used to do, or I could do if we, in your imagination, if you lower an air balloon into a bowl of water and then you release the air balloon, it pops into the air. And now ask yourself, why? You know the answer. Because the water wants to come back to where the balloon has entered. Pressure, water pressure. That's the understanding of what chaos is with creation. Always pressure, always wanting to come back. And if Israel does not sustain the creation as intended by God, chaos wins. So the doing of Torah, the doing of these things we talked about, to keep the meat from the milk separate and to do these things, enacting the created order in a particular way, is to follow God's intention and allow God's Spirit to be in the world, keeping chaos at bay. It's literally a manifestation of God's sustaining the world from chaos, or as modern Jews call it, tikkun olam, the restoration or the keeping of the world. Now, once you kind of get this, and then you kind of go through the creation story in the first 7 days, and I'll truncate this a little. I'll make it a little bit shorter. Notice the pattern. And this is hard because your translations don't do the Hebrew well on this. But the pattern in the Hebrew is, there was darkness, there was light, day 1. There was darkness, there was light, day 2. Right? I could do this 6 times. There was darkness, there was light. But you realize that the pattern is creation out of chaos. Chaos wants back, and God keeps expanding the creation until it is ordered as God intended in the 7th-day creation. The 7th day, this is fascinating, right? Darkness does not come back. There was light, right? So there's light at the beginning. God separated the light from the darkness. And then there's light at the end. Darkness, there was light. The 7th day, there's no more darkness. The creation has been ordered as God intended. Manifest in the Jewish practices of Torah, now I submit to you the leap of thinking. That is the earliest Jewish Christian understanding of what the resurrection of Jesus Christ is. The Synoptic Gospels tell us that it was sometime on the night of the Sabbath that the resurrection took place. In other words, the Sabbath, the light of the Sabbath, did not die. It did not, right, go back to start over with chaos again. So the idea of the resurrection is the ordering of creation as God intended. The idea of the resurrection is the Jewish Sabbath forever. And that, right? I mean, you want to make this simple for yourself. Why Christians baptize in water? Why we think, right, from water comes this new Christian, which is a manifestation of the resurrection, because water's chaos. And out of chaos comes creation. And you start to get even some of the earliest ways that we think about this symbolically in the earliest Jewish Catholic understanding. Now, having said that, you can start to understand some really interesting things. Now, I'll just give you a few things that, okay, now you kind of start to get it, right? Jesus is baptized and rises out of the water in the Gospel of Mark. And then, here's the mistranslation of all mistranslations in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 10. The Spirit of God descended into Jesus, in the form of a dove, descended into Jesus. The Spirit of God in the form of a dove descended into Jesus. Jesus is the manifestation of the creation as God intended. Everything he does, right, in terms of his activity to form a community in the world, is the formation of a community that God intended the community to be in the act of creation itself. And you just can see it time and time again as you look in the way that Mark, and the other Gospels do this in a different way, presents the story of Jesus. So to go back to what we're talking about here, the idea of God as the fashioner of creation out of chaos. God is the fashioner of creation out of chaos means that the whole point is the creation. That salvation itself is located in the creation. That you don't go anywhere else. Your focus is on what is that creation, what does that look like? Now think about the ramifications of this. That means that you would be worried about how we are in the community in terms of how we treat each other, what our community is, what is social justice, how is that manifest? What is God's intention for human beings? And I submit to you, what does it mean for the material creation itself? Right? We're in the midst of what people refer to as a climate crisis, man-made by the mistreatment of the planet. There you go. God's intention for the material creation itself manifest in this pattern of creation out of chaos. But it means there's real conflict, right? If you look at the Gospel of Mark, for example, darkness and demons are everywhere. And Jesus is challenged by that darkness and demons and the waters and all of that. It is the conflict. But the resurrection is the order of creation out of chaos. And the resurrection is manifest in that meal that those earliest Christians are practicing. And so now you have to describe what that meal looked like. Right? So if you're going to try to get at what the Jewish Christian understanding of the meal looks like. First of all, just recognize that it is, in fact, a meal. Because the meal is a community that practices their relationship as a community in a particularly Jewish way. They all eat. They're concerned about the widow and the orphan. They even take up a collection so that they can feed people who aren't there. They're doing all these Jewish things about God's intention for the creation itself and the community within the creation manifest in the very moment of the meal itself. And that's the content of the resurrection. As I said before, the resurrection is manifest at the meal. Now, if you just think about that for a second, that means if you get modern, you get together and you're going to have the Eucharist, and you're somehow not focused on the creation and the community as God intended, you don't have the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's not manifest. Which is heresy, I guess. But think about that connection, right? Oh, that's what this is. So then you think about all the things that you're doing in your parishes, right? All those, like our stocking of the food shelves and our collecting toys for the kids and all the stuff we do, right? Our befrienders ministry, taking Eucharist to people who are homebound, all the things we do. Because we believe that it is a manifestation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ made fully present in the Eucharist that is impossible without those things, without those relationships, without that kind of caring. And that's the Jewish understanding of what the meal is. And you can just see that you can start, I hope you can, start to see the tension here. Is it about the other world, transcendent spiritual world of God, or is it somehow have to be connected to the world that we're in and the salvation of the world that we're in? And I know what you're going to say, and you should say it. Obviously both. And that is the genius of the Christian tradition. Because if you have the mysterious, I'll be blatant. If you have adoration until the cows come home and then do nothing in social justice, you just missed the point. But on the other side, I don't want to guess. Right? But on the other side, right? The reason that we do, why we stock the food shelves is because we can come to the Eucharist. Because it's a manifestation of God's presence spiritually in the world. But the thing about this, it's just using the Gospel of Mark as an example, that the Spirit of God entered into Jesus. The thing about Christianity, the one thing it never, ever, ever could get over, it couldn't quite get it, was to separate the world of creation from the world of God. It wanted to, parts of it wanted to. Because to an ancient Greek, the world of creation is a category mistake, and if we could just get to the spiritual world of God, then we'd have it. But the Christian church couldn't quite make that break, never could. And so even though it really wandered on the edges of that, it always was pulled back down. It was always pulled back down to the Spirit of God was inside of the creation itself. And that understanding, that's what we mean by the word incarnation. God's Spirit, God's presence, God's intention in the world itself. And therefore, the world itself is the subject of God's concern and the subject of the people of God. So that's kind of the the nutshell version, what we're talking about. Pull that from one slide. I go through it here, but you don't have to go through it here. But notice, it's interesting to notice how the creation is ordered in the 7 days, right? Spatial areas are created in day 1, day 2, and 3. And then the occupants of those areas are created in day 4 and day 5 and day 6. So as you're looking at that creation narrative, you realize that there was an intention to the order of creation. And that's why keeping kosher fits into this, because there are certain things that occupy the world in a certain way that manifest the order of creation. Right? Lobsters are not kosher, fish are, but it's the way they occupy the spatial area of the waters and on and on. Okay. The biblical drama, talked about that. The Sabbath day. The Sabbath itself. To reiterate, creation as it should be. The creation intended by God. The content of eschatological perfection. The salvation of the creation, not the salvation from the creation. The Sabbath is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The Eucharist is the Sabbath and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is why in the stories in the Gospels, Jesus is always doing stuff on the Sabbath. You might notice this. It's because he is the Sabbath. And the challenge to Jesus is almost always chaos. Now let me give you in a nutshell then how this works. As I said, the original pattern of the universe, God fashions the creation out of chaos, and chaos wants to come back. In the gospel story, chaos does. Right? So the story of Jesus is the story of the primordial creation. The world as God intended in the 7-day creation is the ministry of Jesus Christ. In the story, the chaos, the opposition to Jesus, demons, certain teachers who teach differently than Jesus, water that wants to kill Jesus when it sinks the boat, storms, right? There are all these manifestations of chaos in the Gospels. And then at the end of the story, at the cross, chaos wins. Chaos wins. Jesus dies. Chaos is all there is. What happened? God creates. God creates. The resurrection of Jesus, God raised Jesus, is not, and this is really important theologically, is not the raising of a particular individual named Jesus, but the raising by God of a creation out of primordial chaos. What God intended for the creation itself is manifest in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the resurrection of a particular kind of community manifest in the world that enacts the creation that God intended. Why the early Christians thought it was the manifestation of the resurrection of Jesus at their corporate meal. The whole thing. The feeding and taking care of each other. The idea that all are children of God. The idea of this radical humanity gathered. The resurrection of Jesus Christ manifest. Not a particular moment. Not a particular thing in that sense. Although they were eating the food, and the thingness about it, that's a great word, thingness, is that they were sharing the bread and the cup as one people, and they all got to eat. Now, that's it. That's the difference. And it's interesting because that becomes pretty controversial pretty fast. I'm going to skip that. I'm skipping so much. This is the story of chaos out of creation in the biblical story. I'll just show you this real quickly because it is fascinating, because I could do a slide like this. In the origins of the creations, God's with chaos, and God fashions the chaos into creation. And then chaos wants to come back in the story of the Bible. So it comes back in the story of Noah. Right? So you remember Noah's Ark? Chaos, waters cover the face of the earth. And there's one righteous man, Noah, on a boat, right? That is creation spared by the complete domination of chaos. And then you might be fascinated by this. How does Noah find out whether or not chaos has been fashioned by God again into creation again? He's floating out there in a boat. The whole earth is covered with water. Right? Sends out a dove. Dove goes out there, right? Comes back, nothing. Still all chaos. Wait 7 days. Wait 7 days. Send the dove out again. Dove goes out there, comes back. It's got a fig leaf in its mouth, olive or whatever the thing was, right? And then Noah, oh my gosh, there's something out there other than chaotic water. Creation is back. Wait another 7 days. Send the dove out. You know what's interesting about that story? That all the early Christians realize, that the Gospel of Mark realizes? The dove doesn't come back. Noah sends the dove out. Apparently there's creation out there somewhere, right? Aha, now you know. The dove does come back. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 10. The Spirit, in the form of a dove, entered into Jesus. The creation is back. And it is Jesus Christ in the story of the gospel. And now you got to get a hold of this. This is why fundamentalists, literalists need help. The Noah story is not about an actual boat on an actual flooding of the earth. It's about the primordial contest between chaos and creation. And the early Christians understood that to be the manifestation of the creation and the ordering of chaos in the ministry of Jesus Christ. And then they would have understood the pattern of the return of chaos, which takes place in the Exodus, and you're crossing through the waters. Remember, you've got to split the waters again to Israel can go across, and you could have creation again in the wilderness. And then you realize in the Gospel of Mark, they cross over in a boat, right? And then by the time you get to chapter 6, you get to the wilderness where you can have the Lord's Supper in the story of Mark. But water comes back in the story of Exodus, and God separates the waters from the waters. Just think about the fact that the Exodus story of the split of the waters is Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. The Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters, and God separated the waters from the waters. And creation came out of that. And Israel coming out of the waters of the Exodus, in the story of the Exodus, is now the creation coming out of chaos. And so Israel represents the order of creation that God intended, the community that God intended in the world. And what do you get? The 10 Commandments. The order of the community and creation as God intended is encapsulated in the event of the Exodus, followed by the commandments of God in the law of God. And now you're going, oh my gosh. And you're thinking, oh, really? Oh my gosh. So the story of Matthew is that Jesus takes on the role of Moses, and by the 5th chapter, Jesus climbs up to a mountain to give the commandments of God, the new Torah. And you realize how the early Christians thought of what he was in terms of the ordering of the creation out of chaos and the holding back of chaos, and why we have to do that, right? Because chaos wants to come back. Hunger wants to come back. Not caring wants to come back. Loneliness wants to come back. Children in need, that wants to come back. Evil, what we would call evil, the way the world should not be, is constant. It wants to dominate. And the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the holding back of those waters, of that primordial chaos that's all around us. And so there's a reason to do it, because you're literally saving creation by Christian practice. You're literally enacting the intention of God for the creation itself. And there, you keep going, there's more to the story, right? You get another event of chaos, crossing the Jordan River on dry land. You all know the story from the book of Joshua. You think, oh my gosh, they cross through the waters again. So every time they get to chaos, you get the order of creation again. And there it is, in the slide 2. You get the destruction of the temple in 587, which is chaos again, followed by the order of creation again. And then you get to how Christians thought of the death of Jesus Christ as the primordial chaos returning, followed by the church, the new creation, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the pattern is chaos to creation, and then the resurrection as the final statement against chaos, which is what the church is in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And the cross is that moment of chaos, which means, I know this might be a little push here. I'm going to push you a little bit. Which means that the entire biblical story has been about Jesus. The primordial struggle between creation and chaos that's been the entire story of Israel is what Jesus does in his ministry. It's the same struggle that has always been the struggle up until now in the entire story of Israel, now manifest in the story of Jesus, which is why you see all those allusions to the Old Testament when you read the New Testament. That's why they're there, because they're part of this understanding of that same story. And then this gets weird because you get the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and then the early churches, actually the Gospels are being written just at that time. So enough of that. Go away. Okay. So the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the restoration of the human community and creation out of the chaos according to God's original intention for the creation. This is hard to grasp, right? That the death of Jesus Christ was understood as the moment of primordial chaos, and that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the restoration of the creation as God intended in Genesis. So if you want to understand the way that the early Christians understood Jesus Christ and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, you have to pay attention to Genesis. What was the intention of God? And here's the most important thing about God's creation in Genesis. God created them, male and female, he created them. In the image of God, he created them. God created men and women emphasis, in the image of God. The original human community in the image of God. And think about this, not superiority, not natural inferiority, not your status as opposed to my status. In the image of God, people were created. So that the early Christian understanding that Gentiles could be at the meal, that women could and should be at that meal, that slaves and masters should be at that meal as equal, that people who are of no account as socially inferior in that world should be there at that meal. That's because at that meal, the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the intention of God for the human community within creation. Or as the Gospel of Mark puts it when he heals the paralytic in chapter 2, he resurrects the paralytic and he says this, "Child, resurrect. You are a child of God. Resurrect, I say to you, resurrect." The resurrection is that all are children of God. The fundamental assumption, the fundamental understanding of the human community. And further, right, further, that means that everything we do as a community must reflect that understanding of equality and dignity as human beings gathered. And all of our compassion, all of our empathy, all of our understanding is that God's intention was not what we see all around us. And that's why, that's the fundamental thing that the earliest Christian churches were doing when they gathered all these sorts of people to enact the resurrection of Christ, and then to say that this whole thing is about what we would call social justice, because that's what God intended for the human community. And that's the content of the meal itself. Why they ate the meal was to enact that resurrection. And that's stunning. Now you think about what we're doing, right? When we attend the Eucharist, what are we concerned with? Where do we think salvation is located? And that's the importance of thinking through this as a meal. And maybe being critical of some of the ways that we practice this meal. Because the question is whether or not the meal itself reflects God's intention for a human community that all are children of God. And that's where I get into trouble, because I don't see it. Genesis 1:27 is what we've been talking about. Humans and male and female, he created them. Paul's description of the Lord's Supper, right? Our earliest description. For all of you who are baptized into Christ, think about this. For all of you who have entered into the chaos and come into the resurrection, all who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. You are now part of the resurrection. And he's actually talking about the fact that the Christians used to change clothing when they baptized. There is neither Jew nor Greek. Jews don't like Greeks. Greeks don't like Jews in that world. Paul says there is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor a free person. Nobody in the ancient world would have bought that. Natural, slave, inferior. That's why they're slaves. The people who are slaves are naturally slaves. Aristotle taught us this. Right? People who are slaves are naturally slaves. Now, think about that, right? The whole basis of the entire history of racism in the United States is in that one idea. People who are slaves, in this case in our country, black people, are naturally slaves. They are naturally inferior. And you just keep going with that, right? Right down to the present day. You get modern racism. That idea, right, that slaves are naturally slaves, is eradicated. All are children of God. So all those forms of bigotry and racism and all that stuff you can think about, all is just pure bullshit. And this idea, all are children of God. And finally, there is not male and female. Right? In the context of the ancient world, females are marked as inferior. I tell students this all the time. The ovum, right? You would say people come from both the ovum and the sperm. Not in the ancient world. Male sperm is incubated by females because there's no egg. They don't know about an egg. They don't know about the ovum. And then the male sperm is incubated. And if it comes to full maturation, it becomes a male baby. But if it doesn't get there, it's a female baby. So all males are naturally mature, superior beings than females, biologically. Right? Yet, in this version of it, females don't have this. They are, as Genesis says, created in the image of God and at the table. And they would never have been at the table in the ancient world. They would be at the Christian table because of this idea. And interestingly enough, women play a larger and more interesting role in the history of the earliest Christian churches than in the surrounding culture, which is fascinating. In other words, because of this idea, ancient Christian churches there were more women involved and more women in leadership positions. In fact, what's fascinating, if you read Paul's letters, in the 16th chapter of Romans, I invite you to do this, count the number of women involved in Paul's co-missionary activity. Not only do you have the reference in Philippians, but not only do you have Paul including women as what he calls fellow workers, that is missionaries, he also talks about Phoebe as a patroness of the church, and he can talk about female apostles. So it's really striking that would have been the case. But I'm trying to say is there is a rationale for why it would have been in these earliest communities, in the context of that ancient world. 1 Corinthians. How much time do I have? Am I out of time? I'm like, what, 60 seconds? I got to wrap it up. I'll wrap it up by, I'll make this go away and wrap it up. Oh, I can't make it go away. So don't look at that. There are various ways in which this comes out in the text, but one more tidbit, right, in terms of how the meal was practiced. That was a real meal, right? In the ancient world, people of higher status got more food because you always had to indicate who was higher status. And then early Christians start to do that. People of high status in the community would get more food. And Paul goes nuts. He tells them, that's not the Lord's Supper. That's not the resurrection. That's not the absolute equality in the image of God, children of God, that was intended by God at Genesis. He rails against them. And you can see that the content of the meal in the earliest Christian churches was this radical equality, radical inclusiveness, which was the manifestation of the resurrection itself. So if I had more time, that's what we'd do. We'd go into some of that. It's absolutely fascinating. And if you want to buy my book, I do a lot of it there for the Gospel of Mark. Okay, now I'm done.
We can take some questions yet, Charles. Teresa, do we have any online? Any questions? Here. Oh boy, we got lots of questions. And then you can hand it across.
I'm wondering what you think about the situation where recently in the past few years there has been an encouragement by the Pope, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Patriarch, East Orthodox, for congregations to do services of creation. And they prepared a lot of liturgical materials for this. And I know at my church they're suggesting 6 weeks of it in the fall. So we've been doing it.
Wow.
And so what I'm wondering from what you've been talking about, how you see, this is coming out, I think probably initiated by Pope Francis, I'm not sure, but
Sure.
I think it is. And then his documents and all that. But anyway, he's
Yeah.
invited and included and gotten participation from these other
Yeah.
places. So how do you see the climate crisis and this reordering, chaos and all that's happening now, and maybe a transition in philosophy towards the Jewish side of things?
Yeah.
It seems like a major reformation or something that's happening within churches or just within the belief system, like as they shift to this different image. And I know this is a huge question that includes all kinds of aspects, but can you address it in the part of how you've been thinking of it?
Well, first of all, I think it's a welcome development because the ancient Greek understanding tended toward dualism, separation of the world of God from the world of creation. So we have to get away from that. I think we are getting away from that. Pope Francis is getting away from that. So we have to start thinking Jewishly, I would say, about creation itself. And I think anything that we can do liturgically to heal that sense of division, I think we need to attend to it. So yes, I'm absolutely, and we're kind of to blame here in a way. Christianity became very dualistic. You know, our focus was on heaven. And that's a category mistake. If you think that salvation is located in the world and not from the world, then you're doing things like what you talked about, liturgies, thinking through this. Yeah, we have to because we're killing the planet. And Christianity has to be part of the solution, not the problem in this. So, yeah, Michael.
Since Paul did not have access to reproductive science,
Right.
where does his idea of equality come from?
I think it's his reading of Genesis. I honestly think that he inherited this fundamental understanding of the resurrection as the creation of Genesis. And I think this is the largest radical idea in all of the earliest Christian world. Because it was so counter the culture of the time, which was based almost entirely on social status and division. And the Roman Empire, I mean, my gosh, the Roman Empire was not only itself conscious of statuses, but the imposition on other people as of nothing. They are not people. They have no status, which you have to think about this. The Romans executed Jesus Christ on a cross. Right? The Romans exercise of power. And why the crucifixion? Because it's a slow death in public on the side of a road that people can look at for 7 days and realize that all power is Roman. And now those subjects will die they were dying on crosses all the time here, folks. It's not just Jesus. All power is Roman, and the fact that we can do this to you means that you are not a person. We can kill you at will, and we will take your wealth, we will enslave you, and that is the way of the world. The gods favor Rome, and this is obviously the way the world works. And the resurrection of Jesus Christ, as it's understood in the earliest Christian community, is that Roman power, the idea that people are not people, is denied by God. and God's creation. And that is the argument. And I submit to you that it's not immediately obvious that the Roman way of thinking is not true. It's not immediately obvious because you look around the world and it's pretty clearly the way that human beings treat each other and exercise power and conquest, both socially and between nations. So the idea of that's not true, that's not what God intends, and that Christians live by this other idea is located in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And that God raised that not person. God raised that powerless one. And God made a statement. That's not what God intended. And I think that's the heart of Christianity. And that's why I think it's the heart of Christianity to think about the way we are as a community with other people. How we are as people of God and not people of status and power. That, I think, is at the very, very heart of what it means to be a Christian participating in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that's what the meal means. That's what the Eucharist is. And we've got to make the power of that, because it's such a powerful sacrament, can begin to change the world. It already has changed the world in so many good respects. But I'm sad that people aren't going to church and experiencing the Eucharist. I'm sad that our young people are falling away in droves. And I think it's because no one's told them what this is really all about and why it makes sense to participate in this if you believe that that's true. Because it can be the power, right, of God's intention in the world that's manifest. And so that's it. That's why I do what I do. But it's an uphill battle. One more.
As we're
Okay.
about to share a
Yeah.
meal together and listening to your theology of the Lord's Supper, I've been fascinated in Minneapolis. There's a church in North Minneapolis called the Table Minneapolis. And they describe themselves as a table-centric church.
Uh-oh.
And they deliberately don't want a building.
Yep.
And that's the center.
Yeah.
You know, they gather in parks. They gather at recreational centers. As community as possible of a space.
Yeah.
And they invite all people to come and experience the resurrected Jesus Christ. That can create community and push out the chaos.
No, I think we could do that as Catholics. I love churches, but we are first and foremost a community within a church. Right. So, yeah.
Right here.
Yes.
Is the afterlife right here?
Yes. I'm saying that I'll be a little bit radical here. I'm saying that what we do as human beings with each other is what lives on. I know that lives on. I don't want to speculate. I'm not going to say things that I don't know. But I know that the way that we care and the way that we love, I know that never dies.
That's part of the co-creator.
And that's co-creator, that's God's work in the world, the manifestation of God's intention for human beings is the life of God in the world. We are part of that life of God. We participate in all our lives. And when we pass that life that we have created in being that, is what passes on to the next generation. The Jewish people have always said that salvation is in the next Jew who follows Torah. And they live for that. And I live for that. I'm not sure about the rest of the story. But I know what I can do now. And I know how I can live now. And I know that in these things, that what I am will pass down to life that follows. And it will be still the life of God in the world that will never die. So chaos can't win this. But that's all I have on this. And I've had, as all of you had, too many funerals in my life. And all I can say is that I mourn the loss deeply, and then I remember the life that has been given to us by these good people. And I want to carry that on. So that's how I had all this up. My new book on the Eucharist. Well, I'm retiring now, so I have more time to write. So it'll be, I'm thinking I'll probably have a manuscript in the next year or so. And then it's going to be on a popular I'm not writing it for other scholars. I'm writing it for this. So we'll see how fast we can put that
We can have
together.
Charles come
Yeah.
back.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's
Yes.
give Charles a round of
Yes.
applause.